Hello, BookTube. It's Thursday, and that's the day when a small and despised holdout group of booktubers try to elevate poetry onto the stage of BookTube, try to read a poem now and again and say why they like it. I love this endeavor. So I have returned once again to the Norton Anthology of Poetry. I hauled this from the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston a while ago, and love it. It's really good. Norton Anthologies of Literature and Poetry can be really, really good if you find a copy that was made early enough. If you find a copy that was made before current year Twitter politics enter into the decision-making boards of the crews that make these things, then you will find a great collection. Fantastic variety and fantastic notes. You just have to watch the year, that's all. The year should be probably before 2014, 2015, something like that. That's pretty much where you can draw the line. That's pretty much where you can see that the editorial board wasn't operating in terms of what has the longest literary cachet, cast the longest literary shadow, what is really the best things to be included in here, but rather that's when you start to get the very direct sense that they are operating with a completely different criteria for selecting stuff that's in the books. That's especially tragic for me in the Norton Anthology of Literature, because the Norton Anthology of Literature had a great name, and now it does not. The 2021 Norton Anthology of Literature is the Norton Anthology of current year Twitter intersectionality. And to hell with whether or not the stuff that's in there is any good. And to hell with how good the stuff is that you had to chuck in order to make room for the stuff that you're including for current year Twitter intersectionality. Fortunately, my Norton Anthology of Poetry is old enough so that it's just concerned with being really good. And we're going to read a poem today from an American. This is by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was known as Ralph Emerson until he put on literary airs. And this is called the Rhodora. And the subtitle is, On Being Asked, Whence is This Flower? So let's buckle up and read this poem. It's not very long. In May, when sea winds pierced our solitudes, I found the fresh Rhodora in the woods, spreading its leafless blooms in a damp nook to please the desert and the sluggish brook. The purple petals, fallen in the pool, made the black water with their beauty gay. Here might the redbird come his plumes to cool, and court the flower that cheapens his array. Then the poet addresses the flower directly. Rhodora, with an exclamation point. Rhodora, if the sages ask thee why this charm is wasted on the earth and sky, tell them, dear, that if eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being. Why thou wert, O rival of the rose, I never thought to ask, I never knew. But in my simple ignorance supposed the selfsame power that brought me there brought you. I think we can agree that that is metrically lovely. Ralph Waldo Emerson had a very good ear for poetry. In fact, for a lot of people in his own day and in the immediate aftermath of his death, he was mainly a poet. If you would have asked them, they said, oh yeah, the poet from the magazines. Metrically, that is lovely, and the image that it produces is lovely. It almost certainly, as so much of Emerson's poetry, it almost certainly happened. That doesn't really matter, but it's worth thinking about when you think about, when you think about the poem. It almost certainly happened that Emerson was tramping through the woods or through a field and came across a Rhodora. A Rhodora is a kind of rhododendron. It's a pretty flower. When it blooms, it's a pretty flower. It's got a kind of a pale purple bloom. And it can be poetically startling because it does often, from my own experience in the woods around Concord, it does indeed often blossom in places that don't have a riot of color, so that it will seem a lot brighter and more standoutish than it really is. And it can be a moment of wonder. I'm sure that Ralph Waldo Emerson had this moment of wonder. But you notice the poetical overreach, right? One of the elements that is inevitable with so much poetry, and that I don't like anything about contemporary poetry, most of it, but the thing about all poetry, going all the way back to Hesiod, that I tend to rebel against is overreach, where the poet makes a greater case than can be made. And that is true in this case. It's overreach that can only be based on contradiction. There's a contradiction here. Because the narrator of the poem says, if sages ask thee why this charm is wasted on the earth and sky, tell them, dear, that if eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being. Okay, that's one thing. So you're wandering through the woods and you encounter a Rhodora. You encounter this bright flower. Beauty is its own excuse for being. It doesn't need any other purpose. So you see it, and as is the poet's wont, you celebrate it in lovely prose. Okay, fine. But what's the last line of the poem do? The last line of the poem contradicts that completely. I never thought to ask, I never knew, but in my simple ignorance suppose the self-same power with a capital P that brought me there brought you. So now all of a sudden there is a purpose. Now there is a power with a capital P that's arranging for this meeting. It's not that beauty is its own reward. It's that beauty is a tool that a larger unseen power is using to orchestrate a meeting. And that bugs me. It doesn't just bug me. It bugs me because of the hypocrisy involved. And is this just a serendipitous meeting, or is it not? Or is it the grand scheme of a power that is orchestrating a flower to bloom and your footsteps to take you there? It's not just that. It's also, of course, I'm bothered by the fact that you have to cheapen a wonderful moment by making it and you into some sort of marionette on strings. It reminds me of an anecdote. Some biographers have called it apocryphal. I don't think that it is, where President William Howard Taft was being lionized by a blue-haired Silver Spring matron, a blue-haired Washington suburb matron. These type of ladies that, in Taft's day and long before his day and long after his day, you could not brook. You couldn't keep them out of your social gatherings, and you absolutely couldn't ignore them or disparage them. They were the power in the town of Washington, and everybody knew it. And they were ubiquitous. I'm not sure that they still exist in any recognizable form, but when I lived in Washington and in a Washington suburb, they weren't just ubiquitous. They could be terrifying because they knew the power that they wielded, but they could also be adorable. They were also absolutely adorable. There's a story that one of them approached President Taft and said, I think you're the greatest president the United States has ever seen since George Washington. And Taft, who was not an egotistical person, said, why do you have to lug in Washington? I think the same thing when I read a poem like this, and I can read them a chock-a-block. There are a million poems like this. It indulges in the 19th century syrupy sentimentality that was itself the product of many very vigorous and not at all sentimental religious revivalist movements that swept through New England, the upper Midwest, right around the same time. But you encounter this all the time, and I always feel like saying, why do you have to lug in God? You had a beautiful moment. You immortalized it in a beautiful little poem. Why do you have to do that? But nevertheless, I still thought the poem was worth sharing with you. So there you go, the Norton Anthology of Poetry, just in case you're wondering. This Norton Anthology of Poetry came out in 1970. So there you go. That is Poetry Thursday. I will try not to skip Poetry Thursday next week. But in the meantime, I'll wrap this up, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.